the worst punishment of my life turned out to be the greatest gift I never asked for. I know that sounds like the kind of thing people say at the end of therapy when they're trying to make sense of a difficult childhood. But I'm not saying it to be poetic or dramatic. I'm saying it because it's the literal truth of what happened to me in the summer of 1978 when I was 13 years old, living in a 2-story house on Maple Creek Road in rural Ohio, and my mother decided that the usual punishments simply weren't working anymore. Let me back up. My name is Christopher James Whitfield. I go by Chris. I'm 59 years old now, and I've been wanting to tell this story for a long time. Not because I think my life is extraordinary or that my experiences are unique. Actually, it's quite the opposite. I think my story is incredibly ordinary in the most important ways. And maybe that's exactly why it needs to be told. Because somewhere out there right now, there's a kid sitting in his room feeling like the most alone person on the planet. Feeling like nobody in the history of the universe has ever felt what he feels. Feeling like whatever is stirring inside him is so strange and wrong and impossible that he could never, ever say it out loud. I was that kid. And I want him to hear this. So here's where it really begins. My father, Robert Whitfield, left our family when I was 9 years old. He didn't leave dramatically. There was no screaming fight, no suitcases thrown down the stairs, no dramatic exit. He just sort of quietly stopped being there. First it was long work trips. Then it was an apartment in Columbus he needed for those work trips. Then one Sunday afternoon he sat me and my sister down at the kitchen table and explained, in the careful rehearsed language of a man who had practiced this speech many times, that he and Mom were going to live separately from now on. My sister Laura was 12.
She cried.
I sat very still and looked at the placemat in front of me, which had little blue roosters printed on it, and I counted those roosters over and over while Dad talked because it was the only way I could keep everything inside me from spilling out everywhere. There were 8 roosters on that placemat. I counted them probably 40 times during that conversation. Dad moved to Columbus. We saw him on some weekends and holidays. He was never cruel or absent in any dramatic way. He paid child support reliably, showed up when he said he would, took us to movies and miniature golf, and occasionally to Cleveland to see a baseball game. But he was gone from our daily lives, and the house on Maple Creek Road became something different after he left. Mom's name was Patricia. Everyone called her Pat. She was 34 when Dad left, which seems incredibly young to me now, though it felt ancient when I was 9. She worked as a bookkeeper for a local hardware company, drove a 10-year-old Ford that smelled like old coffee and pine air freshener, and raised 2 kids mostly on her own with the occasional help of her sister Carol, who lived 40 minutes away and came over more often after the divorce. Laura, my sister, was the golden child. Not in a favoritism way, not in a way that made me feel unloved. She was just genuinely easy to parent. Good grades, responsible, sensible, helpful around the house. Teachers loved her. Neighbors loved her. She babysat on weekends and saved her money and never stayed out past curfew. And then there was me. I wasn't a bad kid. I want to make that clear. I wasn't mean or destructive or dangerous. But I was restless in a way that adults found difficult to manage. I couldn't sit still. Couldn't stay focused on anything that didn't interest me. Got distracted constantly by things other people didn't even notice. I asked too many questions that didn't have good answers. Questioned rules that seemed arbitrary. Pushed back against authority in ways that teachers found exhausting and Mom found exasperating. My school file probably had phrases like bright but unfocused and does not apply himself and disruptive presence in classroom settings. Those were the polite educational versions of what Mom said at home, which was more along the lines of, Christopher, for the love of everything, why can't you just follow one simple rule for one single day? By the time I was 13, I'd been grounded more times than I could count. The usual stuff. Coming home late, not doing homework, talking back, getting into trouble with a group of boys from my class who spent most of 8th grade daring each other to do increasingly stupid things. It was that last category that finally broke Mom. The dare that did it involved a neighbor's chicken coop, 3 firecrackers, and a decision-making process that seemed much more reasonable at the time than it does in retrospect. Nobody got hurt. The chickens were fine, actually. I think the noise scared them more than anything. But the neighbor, Mr. Patterson, was deeply unimpressed, and he came to our door that evening with a face like a thunderstorm and a list of complaints that took him 11 minutes to deliver. I know because I was watching the kitchen clock from the hallway. After Mr. Patterson left, Mom sat me down. She'd run through her standard punishment menu. Grounded for a month, no TV, no friends, straight home from school. None of it was working. I'd served 4 such sentences in the previous 18 months, and here I was, right back at the kitchen table with an apologetic expression that she'd correctly identified as not entirely genuine. She looked at me for a long time. That particular look she had when she was thinking something through rather than just reacting. "Do you know what the problem is?" she finally said. "The chickens?" "The problem," she said, ignoring that, "is that none of my punishments actually change anything for you. You sit in your room, you wait it out, and then you go right back to the same things. None of it means anything." I didn't have an argument for that because she was completely right. "So, we're going to try something different," she said. I asked what.
She told me.
And that was the moment my life started to change, though I absolutely did not understand that at the time. At the time, I thought it was the worst thing that had ever happened to me. At the time, I would have preferred literally any other punishment on the list. Clean the whole house. Mow every lawn on the street. Write a 10,000-word essay on chicken welfare. Anything. Anything at all other than what she was proposing. Her idea was this. Since nothing else was working, I was going to spend the grounding period helping Laura with her responsibilities around the house. Not just doing chores, but actually working alongside her, the way she worked on her schedule with her standards. And since Laura's primary income came from babysitting the 3 Hendricks kids down the street on Saturday afternoons, I would be going with her. And I would be doing it, Mom said with a calm certainty that told me this was non-negotiable, dressed appropriately for the occasion. I stared at her. What does that mean? It means that Laura will help you get dressed in the morning for chores, and on Saturday for the Hendricks job. Dressed how? I asked, though something in her expression was already telling me, already sending a strange electric charge down my spine that I had no framework for interpreting. Like her, Mom said simply. The silence that followed was enormous. "You're kidding?" I said. "I am not kidding."
"Mom.
You can't be serious." Christopher James Whitfield, I have never been more serious in my life. You think rules don't apply to you. You think consequences are temporary inconveniences. Fine. Let's see how you feel about this one. I tried every argument I had. This was humiliating. This wasn't a real punishment, it was weird. What would the neighbors say? What if someone from school saw me? Dad would never allow this. This wasn't normal. This wasn't fair. Mom let me run through every argument, and when I finally ran out, she said, "Starting tomorrow morning, Laura will help you. You'll cooperate fully, or the alternative is I call your father, explain what happened with Mr. Patterson's chickens, and you spend the rest of the summer in Columbus with him doing inventory at his office every day. Your choice." The Columbus option was somehow even worse. Dad's office was legendarily boring. I'd visited once and nearly died of it. I went to bed that night convinced this was the most unfair thing a parent had ever done to a child in the history of parenting. I could not have been more wrong. Laura's reaction to this arrangement was complicated and interesting. When Mom explained it to her that night while I supposedly couldn't hear through my bedroom floor, I caught fragments. Laura's first response was something like, "Mom, that's kind of weird." And Mom's response was something about teaching responsibility and perspective and natural consequences. Then a pause. Then Laura said something I couldn't quite make out. And then Mom said, "Just be kind about it. That's all I ask." The next morning, Laura knocked on my door at 7:15. She was already dressed, hair done, ready for her Saturday. She looked at me standing in my pajamas with my arms crossed and my expression set to maximum sulk. "Look," she said, "I didn't ask for this either. But Mom's serious and your alternative sounds terrible, so can we just try to get through it without making it a whole thing?" I said fine in the tone of someone saying nothing is fine at all. She had me sit at her vanity, which was this little table with a mirror that had light bulbs around it like a dressing room mirror. She'd saved up her babysitting money for it. She looked at me in the reflection for a moment. Do you want me to explain what I'm doing, or just do it? Something about that question surprised me. It was genuinely respectful, considering the circumstances.
She wasn't mocking me.
Wasn't enjoying my humiliation the way I'd expected. She was just asking a practical question. Explain it, I said, surprising myself.
So she did.
She talked me through everything she was doing. Foundation first, she said, because it evens everything out and gives you a base to work from. Then powder to set it so it doesn't look shiny or slide around. She explained what contouring was, which in 1978 wasn't the elaborate sculpting it became later, just some strategic shading. She talked about why you blend carefully at the edges. Why eyebrow shape matters more than most people realize. Why lip color changes how your whole face reads. I listened. Not because I decided to cooperate cheerfully, but because once she started explaining the logic of it, the actual reasoning behind each step, I found myself genuinely interested. There was a methodology to it. A sequence. A set of principles that, if you understood them, made the whole thing make sense. This was the thing about me that teachers always missed, and Mom was only beginning to understand. I wasn't unfocused. I was intensely focused, just on my own terms. Give me something interesting and I'd absorb every detail. Give me something that didn't make sense to me and I'd tune out entirely. The makeup, explained as a system with reasons behind it, made sense to me. Then came the clothes. Laura had a modest wardrobe by teenage girl standards. Nothing flashy. Practical, nice-looking things that she mixed and matched carefully because money was tight. She held up two options, both summer dresses, and explained the difference. One was more casual, she said, better for doing things around the house. The other was a bit more put together, better for being around other families. For the Hendricks job, the second one, she said. I put it on. It was a simple yellow dress, nothing fancy, with short sleeves and a skirt that came to just above my knees. Laura adjusted the fit, added a thin belt, stepped back and looked at me with her head tilted. You need to walk differently, she said. Walk differently? You walk like you're about to knock something over. It's fine when you're wearing jeans, but in a dress it looks off. Smaller steps. More deliberate. She showed me. I watched. Tried it. She watched me critically, nodded slowly. Better. I looked in the mirror. And I don't know how to explain what happened in that moment. I want to be precise about it because it's important. I didn't have a sudden revelation. I didn't feel immediately comfortable or natural or right. What I felt was more like catching a glimpse of something through a window, just for a second, something on the other side of the glass that I couldn't quite make out, but that made me turn and look again. Something about what I saw when I looked in that mirror made me want to keep looking. That's the truest way I can describe it. But I didn't have time to sit with that feeling because Laura was already moving, explaining that we needed to get started on the morning chores before the heat of the day settled in. The morning chores with Laura were nothing like the chores I was usually assigned. When Mom told me to clean my room, it meant stuffing things in the closet until the closet no longer closed, and then using my body weight to force it shut. When Laura cleaned, she had a system. Each thing had a place. Each task had an order. She explained as we went, patiently, in the same practical tone she'd used during the makeup explanation. We cleaned the kitchen, the two bathrooms, swept the front porch, watered Mom's garden. It took about 2 hours. The whole time, I was aware of the dress I was wearing in a way that was hard to define. Not uncomfortable, exactly. Not comfortable either. Just present. Like a constant small reminder of itself. We broke for lunch. I ate a sandwich at the kitchen table while Laura reviewed a list she'd written for the afternoon's babysitting job. She looked up at me. You're being really quiet. Thinking, I said. About what? I didn't answer that honestly. I said I was thinking about whether Mr. Patterson would say anything to Mom about whether she was going to make me apologize personally to him. Laura accepted this explanation and went back to her list. But the truth was I was thinking about the mirror. About that glimpse through the window feeling. About why, sitting at that kitchen table in my sister's dress, I felt a strange kind of calm that I couldn't account for. The Hendricks kids were 7, 5, and 3. Their mother, Janet, was a nurse who worked Saturday afternoons and occasionally evenings. Her husband traveled for work. Laura had been looking after them for 8 months and had a comfortable routine with them. We walked the 4 houses down to the Hendricks, and when Janet opened the door, I braced for the reaction. She looked at me, looked at Laura, looked back at me. "This is my brother Chris," Laura said simply. "He's helping me today." Janet Hendricks looked at me for one more second. Then she just said it was nice to have extra hands, gave us the rundown on the afternoon, kissed her kids goodbye, and left.
Just like that.
The 3 kids, Marcus, Sophie, and little Benny, didn't even blink. Marcus wanted to know if I knew how to play a card game called War. Sophie immediately grabbed my hand and started showing me her collection of small plastic horses. Benny climbed onto the couch next to me and leaned against my arm like we were old friends. Children, I discovered that afternoon, don't really care about what you're wearing. They care whether you're paying attention to them, whether you'll get down on the floor and look at things from their level, whether you make them feel like what they're saying matters. I was good with the kids. Really good, in a way that surprised me. Better than I was at most things, actually. I was patient with them in a way I wasn't usually patient. I listened to Sophie's elaborate stories about her plastic horses with genuine interest. I played 17 consecutive rounds of War with Marcus and lost most of them. I held Benny when he got scared because a dog barked loudly outside, and he buried his face in my shoulder, and I just held him steady until it passed. Walking home that evening, Laura was quiet for the first block. Then she said, "You were really good with them." "They're easy to be around," I said. "Most boys your age would have been terrible at that." I didn't know what to do with the compliment, so I just shrugged. But it stayed with me. It stayed with me for a long time. The punishment lasted 3 weeks. Every morning, Laura helped me get ready. Every Saturday, we went to the Hendricks together. The routine became oddly normal quickly, in the way that almost anything becomes normal if you do it enough times. But things were shifting inside me in ways I was only beginning to track. Around the 2nd week, something changed in how I was experiencing getting dressed in the morning. The first few days it had been something I endured, got through, moved past. By the 2nd week, I found myself less resistant to it. By the end of the 2nd week, I was making small choices. Preferring one of Laura's blouses over another when she offered options. Paying more attention to how my hair looked. Laura noticed. She didn't make a big deal of it. Didn't tease me or announce it. She just quietly responded to it. Started offering more choices.
Took a bit more time.
Asked my opinion occasionally. One morning in the 3rd week, she said something casual while she was doing my makeup. She said, "You know, some people just feel more comfortable like this. There's nothing wrong with it." I didn't respond. I looked at myself in the mirror. She kept working. "Janet Hendricks has a nephew," she continued conversationally. "He lives in Michigan somewhere. She mentioned him once. He just lives his life the way he wants and his family's fine with it." She said it like she was mentioning the weather, like it was the most ordinary piece of information in the world.
And that was Laura.
She never made a speech about it. Never sat me down and had a serious conversation. She just quietly laid down a different framework. One in which what was happening between us in that room every morning wasn't strange or wrong.
It was just something some people did.
Some people felt. Something with room in the world for it. I loved my sister for 1,000 reasons, but that might be at the top of the list. The 3 weeks ended. Mom said the punishment was over. Back to normal. I went back to normal. Jeans and t-shirts. No more Saturday trips to the Hendricks with Laura. No more mornings at the Vanity. But normal felt different now. I couldn't have explained how or why at 13. I just knew that something had been opened that I couldn't close back up. A room in myself that I hadn't known was there had been unlocked, and even when I walked back out and shut the door, I could still feel it behind me. Still feel the space of it. High school in Ohio in the early 80s was not, to put it gently, a particularly welcoming environment for boys who had complicated feelings about gender and identity. The culture was straightforward in its expectations. Boys played sports. Boys dated girls. Boys drove trucks and talked about engines and competed for social dominance in the clear established hierarchy of the American high school ecosystem. I played baseball well enough to make the team, which gave me cover. I was athletic and reasonably good-looking and funny in the self-deprecating way that tends to make people comfortable, so I had friends. I dated a girl named Amy in sophomore year, then Nicole in junior year. I went to prom. I wore a rented tuxedo and danced badly and did everything correctly. And underneath all of it, I carried the memory of those 3 weeks like a small warm thing I kept in my chest. Took it out sometimes when I was alone. Turned it over. Put it back. I didn't act on it in high school. The stakes felt too high, and the language for it didn't exist in my world yet. This was before the internet, before the shift in cultural conversation that would eventually make these kinds of explorations imaginable for a middle-class kid from rural Ohio. In my world in 1980, you simply didn't. But the feelings were there. They'd always been there, I understood now. The punishment hadn't created them. It had just let them surface long enough that I could recognize them, even if I didn't yet know what to do with them. Laura and I never explicitly talked about it. We had this understanding that lived below words. She'd check in sometimes in small ways. Ask if I was okay. Say things in passing that were probably pointed, but could also be taken as just sisterly conversation. When she left for college in 1980, she gave me one of her scarves. Just handed it to me before she got in the car with all her boxes.
For cold mornings, she said.
I still have that scarf. It's folded in a drawer in my bedroom right now. I went to Ohio State. Studied business administration. Graduated in 1987 and got a job at a manufacturing company in Cincinnati doing supply chain coordination. Moved into an apartment with a college friend named Derek, who was one of those effortlessly normal people who moved through the world without any apparent internal friction. Living alone for the first time meant freedom I hadn't had. It also meant the thing I'd been suppressing for 5 years didn't have to stay suppressed anymore.
I was careful about it.
Deliberate. I wasn't reckless by nature. Never had been after that chicken coop incident aged my risk assessment significantly. I built my private life the way I'd watched Laura build her routines. Systematically, thoughtfully, with attention to what worked and what didn't. I explored carefully. Understood myself better in that small Cincinnati apartment than I had in the previous 22 years. Began to understand that what I felt wasn't a phase or a confusion or a temporary thing. It was a consistent, central part of who I was. Not all of who I was. Just a real, genuine piece. What I still didn't have was language for it. I wasn't transgender in the way I've come to understand that word. I wasn't confused about my gender identity in some profound, destabilizing way. What I felt was more like a dimension of myself that existed alongside everything else. That needed expression sometimes. That made me more complete when it could breathe. The word I eventually settled into, years later, was simply this. I was a man who sometimes needed to express the feminine parts of himself. Who was more whole when both sides had room to exist. I know that's not a dramatic or easily categorized identity. It doesn't fit neatly into the conversations people tend to have. But it's mine, and it's true, and I've spent 46 years refining my understanding of it. I met Catherine in 1991 at a work function. She was a financial analyst for one of our suppliers, sharp and funny, and somewhat intimidating in the way that genuinely competent people can be. We started talking at a networking dinner and closed down the bar at the hotel talking about everything except work. We dated for 2 years. I loved her. Genuinely, deeply, in the particular way that I'd begun to understand I was capable of loving people, which was with my whole attention once I gave it. And I told her. 6 months into dating her, before I was in love enough that the prospect of losing her would have been catastrophic, I told her. I want to be clear about how that conversation went because I think it matters to the story. I sat her down one evening at my apartment. Made dinner, which I was decent at by then. After dinner I said there was something I needed her to know about me, something real, and that I understood completely if it changed things between us. I told her about the punishment summer. About Laura. About understanding this part of myself through those years. About what it actually looked like in practice, which was private and modest, and not something I'd ever asked a partner to participate in if they weren't comfortable. Catherine listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Then she poured herself another glass of wine and sat with it for a moment. "Is this a sexual thing?" she asked. I thought about how to answer that honestly. Not primarily. It's more like there's a part of me that needs expression sometimes. It makes me feel more settled, more complete. It's not about performance or fantasy. It's about feeling whole. Are you attracted to men?
No.
I'm attracted to you. Very attracted to you. Have you ever talked to anyone about this? My sister knows. She's always known. Another pause. Catherine turned her wine glass slowly in her hands. I need to think about this, she said. I said of course. Absolutely. She should take all the time she needed. She called me 4 days later. Said she'd done a lot of thinking. Had talked to her therapist. Had read some things. I'm not fully sure how I feel about all of it, she said. But I know how I feel about you. And I think I'd rather be in a relationship where we're honest with each other about complicated things than a relationship where everything looks tidy because we're both pretending. We stayed together. Got married in 1993. Had 2 sons, David and Patrick. Built a life in Cincinnati in a house with a yard and a dog and all the familiar architecture of American middle-class existence. And Catherine and I figured it out together. Found the balance that worked for us. It wasn't always easy. There were conversations that needed to be revisited. Boundaries that got renegotiated. Moments where the complexity of it pressed on her and she needed space to process. But she never ran. Never made me feel wrong or broken. Asked questions instead of making assumptions. Learned alongside me. Laura came to our wedding. She and Catherine met properly for the first time that weekend and got along immediately in the way that certain people do when they share an essential quality of character. Both of them were straight shooters. Both of them were, at core, just deeply practical in their approach to human complexity. During the reception, Laura pulled me aside for 5 minutes. Looked at me with those big sister eyes that had first looked at me in the vanity mirror 40 years ago.
You told her, she said.
Not a question. 6 months in. She smiled. Good. You're not surprised. Chris, I've been waiting for you to figure out how to do this right for 15 years. I'm just glad it didn't take longer. We laughed and went back to the party. David was born in 1995 and Patrick in 1998. Being a father changed things, as it always does, in ways nobody can fully prepare you for. The way love reorganizes itself around a new center. The way your understanding of your own childhood reshapes when you're on the other side of the parenting relationship. I thought about Mom a lot those years. About what she'd been doing when she handed down that unusual punishment to a 13-year-old who terrorized a neighbor's chickens. Because here's the thing I've understood more fully as I've gotten older. I don't believe my mother knew exactly what she was doing. I don't think she looked at her restless, difficult, unfocused 13-year-old son and thought, what this boy needs is to explore gender expression, and here's how I'll create that opportunity. I think she was just a tired, intelligent, creative single mother who had run out of conventional options. I think she looked at her daughter's responsible, methodical, careful way of moving through the world and thought, maybe some of that will rub off. But I also think, and this is the part I've sat with for decades, that she might have seen something. Mothers see things. I've seen things in my own sons that they don't know I've seen. Mothers notice. Maybe she noticed something. Maybe she thought that this particular unusual thing, handled carefully by a kind older sister, might give her complicated son something he needed. Not a lesson about responsibility or consequences. Something else. Something harder to name. I asked her once. I was about 45, she was 72, and we were sitting on her back porch in the afternoon, and it was one of those late summer days that feel like they're trying to hold on to something. The summer of 78, I said. The punishment. She looked at me steadily. Yes. Did you know what you were doing? A pause. A small smile. I knew my son was unhappy in a way I didn't have a name for. I knew my daughter had something he needed to learn, though I couldn't have told you exactly what. And I knew that doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results wasn't working. So no. So partly. The rest I was making up as I went. Did Laura tell you? After? About what it was actually like? She told me you seemed more at peace. I sat with that for a moment. More at peace. My sister's description of 13-year-old me, put on the record for our mother, 3 weeks into the strangest summer of my life. Did it help? Mom asked. More than anything, I said. She nodded, looking out at her garden.
Good.
The boys grew up knowing that their father had, as David once described it to a friend when he was about 10 and Patrick was 7, some different ways about him. Kids are resilient and adaptable in ways adults underestimate. What they need is honesty delivered at an age-appropriate level, consistency, stability, and the clear sense that the adults in their lives are anchored and trustworthy. Catherine and I provided those things. The boys grew up with them and became, as far as I can tell, secure and decent young men who have good relationships with their partners and good values generally. I had the conversation with each of them at different points in their teenage years. With David at 16, Patrick at 15. Different conversations because they were different people. David asked careful, analytical questions and then filed the information away and seemed to integrate it fairly smoothly. Patrick cried a little, asked if I was okay, then also seemed to integrate it fairly smoothly. The conversations I'd been dreading for years turned out to be far less seismic than I'd feared. Both boys essentially took the information and adjusted their picture of their father slightly and then continued to love him without apparent disruption. Laura attended their graduations, their weddings, all the landmark events. She's my closest friend, has been for decades. We talk every week. She's 72 now and lives in Oregon with her husband Frank and an unreasonable number of houseplants. She still checks in her characteristic way, asks if I'm okay, says things in passing that might be pointed but could also be just sisterly conversation that I retired 3 years ago. Catherine and I moved from Cincinnati to a smaller house in western North Carolina in the mountains with good hiking and 4 seasons and a community we're slowly becoming part of. I've started writing. Not publicly until now. Just for myself, to get things down and understand them. The discipline of putting experiences into language forces a clarity that just thinking doesn't always produce. What I understand now at 59 that I couldn't have understood at 13 is how the strange punishment of that summer was actually an act of accidental grace. My mother, improvising under pressure, handed me an experience that cracked open a window I'd never have opened myself. Laura, 16 years old and asked to do something unusual, responded with kindness and matter-of-fact acceptance that planted in me the understanding that this part of myself wasn't something monstrous to be hidden forever. I spent a lot of my 30s and early 40s still managing it carefully, keeping it contained, presenting my complete self only in the safety of my own home, with Catherine's matter-of-fact acceptance mirroring Laura's from all those years before. In my 50s, I've gradually stopped managing it so tightly. I present myself more fully in more contexts. Not dramatically or loudly. Just honestly. I don't hide things that don't need to be hidden. The world has changed enormously since that summer on Maple Creek Road. The language exists now that didn't exist then. The conversations happen now that couldn't happen in 1978 in rural Ohio. Young people have access to communities and understanding and frameworks that I spent 40 years constructing for myself out of fragments and silence. That's something worth recognizing. Something worth celebrating. If you're watching this and you're young, I want you to hear this clearly. You have access to things I didn't have. You can find the language for what you're feeling. You can find the community of people who felt it too. You can find the understanding that it took me until I was well into adulthood to piece together from small, quiet moments. Use that access. Be brave enough to use it. And if you're watching this and you're not young, if you're in your 40s or 50s or 60s and you're recognizing yourself in the story, hear this instead. It is never, not once, not even slightly, too late to understand yourself more completely. The years you spent not knowing don't negate the years you have left knowing. The greatest punishment of my life was 3 weeks in my sister's clothes, assigned by a frustrated mother who'd run out of other ideas. It turned out to contain more truth about who I actually was than anything else in my childhood. Mom's been gone for 11 years now. I miss her every day in that way that just lives in the background of everything. But I had that conversation with her on her back porch. She knew what those 3 weeks had meant.
She knew I was okay.
She knew I'd found my way. And Laura's scarf is still folded in a drawer in my bedroom. Some things you keep. Thank you for watching. If this story reached you in some way, leave a comment below. I read every single one. And I'll see you in the next one.